Sometime in the mid-11th century, an impoverished Norman rides toward the city of Bisignano. He had an appointment with one of the city's leading men. Halfway between the city and the Norman hideout in San Marco, the rogue and the magnate meet on the east bank of the river Croti. No doubt they would have studied one another intently. The representative of the city, which ultimately answered to Constantinople, was a Greek by the name of Peter, a cog in the sprawling Byzantine machine. Across from him was the Norman representative, Robert, embodying much of the best his people had to offer. Starved and cornered, this blonde and blue-eyed Norman specimen was robust, with an aristocratic bearing that hardly squared with his infamy. Already his cheeks were rubricated by the Mediterranean sun, his eyes aflame with a bluish glow, as sly as it was menacing. Peter's failure to notice that gleam in Robert's eye was the second of two mistakes. The first was that he had allowed himself to be lured beyond the city walls. Before he knew it, the Norman had yanked him clean out of the saddle and was half carrying, half dragging him through the hills to San Marco. In due time, the humiliated magnate would be ransomed back to his city for a healthy chunk of change, enough to launch Robert's own career, while his half-brothers established themselves elsewhere in the peninsula. In true Norman fashion, Robert had made his own way. With this first and cautious step toward the fulfillment of his destiny, Robert would get the name Guiscard, alternately translated as the resourceful, the cunning, the weasel, and the fox. During his rise from rogue to duke, one detects the threads that run through the entire tapestry of the Norman saga: opportunism, pragmatism, audacity, unfailing good fortune, or perhaps divine intervention. In just 3 generations, the Normans would go from rootless mercenaries haunting the Italian countryside to kings of a prized Mediterranean possession. For the first time in almost 500 years, all of southern Italy would be united under a single banner, that of the Hauteville family. Theirs would be the most prominent of Norman dynasties behind the line of Rollo, and if the preeminent English historian of the 12th century is to be believed, even William the Conqueror was envious of their exploits. The story of the Hautevilles and the Italian Normans in general would prove one of, if not the most swashbuckling chapter in all the Middle Ages. Today we will recount that chapter through a series of vignettes, each of which tells us a thing or two about the lives and times of the Italian Normans. Though we can't cover everything in just one video, stick around till the end so you can find out exactly where to go to learn even more about this extraordinary period. In 1018 AD, a large Byzantine army crushed a force of Lombard rebels at the Battle of Cannae. Though the battle is overshadowed by its ancient counterpart, it was certainly significant in the context of the Normans. They had fought as mercenaries on the side of the Lombards. After their defeat, they took to the hills and elected Rainulf, their fallen commander's brother, to take his place. Rainulf was a Drengo, not a Hauteville, and thanks to his efforts, his family eventually became the second most important in the region. Under Rainulf's leadership, the Normans raided the countryside and slowly replenished their ranks until new mercenary contracts availed themselves. In many ways, this was the template for future Norman expansion. Southern Italy was then a fractured land of chaos and opportunity. Had it been solidly ruled by any of Rome's successors, by the Byzantine Empire, the Holy Roman Empire, or the Holy See of Rome, the Normans would never have had the opportunity to entrench themselves in the region. But because each of these powers was usually focused on something else, a war of conquest here, an internal struggle there, southern Italy remained a power vacuum. The Byzantine governors or catapans were increasingly on the defensive, and time again, reinforcements from Constantinople failed to materialize. In 1025, the formidable Basil II, better known as Basil the Bulgar Slayer, died before his expedition to the region was underway. In 1038 and 1042, 2 more expeditions were cut short due to the recall of the commanding officer. All the while, the empire was threatened by incursions from the east. The Seljuk Turks were sweeping in and slowly dislocating Anatolia. In the north, the Holy Roman Empire had grown increasingly disenchanted with the peninsula after the disastrous misadventures of the Ottonian ruling family. Geographically speaking, the Holy Roman Empire was also blocked off from southern Italy by the frigid mountains of the Alps and the malarial marshland at the center of the peninsula. In the meantime, the Muslims who dominated Sicily were busy bickering between themselves. About 2 centuries earlier, they had gotten as far as Rome, and only the Aurelian walls saved it from being sacked. Now on the back foot, their raids up the coast correspondingly declined. The Lombards were likewise shadows of their former selves, paying lip service to the court of Constantinople while increasingly turning to the Normans as a possible source of relief. As for the popes, well, we'll get to the popes. The Normans never planned to fill this power vacuum. Slowly but surely, they were sucked in anyway. Over time, they accumulated men, material, and mastery alike. A raid here, a mercenary contract there, maybe a hostage like the unfortunate magnate Peter. It's hard to tell how much of it was done in the spur of the moment. Had Robert planned to make off with his Byzantine governor, or was this another Sicilian gambit? Before Robert, Rainulf had found himself presented with similar opportunities, and under his leadership, the Normans became the premier mercenaries of Italy, often finding themselves on both sides of any given battle. The Normans on the winning side would help negotiate lenient terms for their less fortunate countrymen. That way, no matter how the battle went, the Normans still came out on top. In the 1030s, Rainulf was paid by the Lombard aristocrat Pandulf to overthrow Sergius of Naples. Acting more and more like a power broker, he secured Naples with ease. A few years later, the deposed Sergius dangled the city of Aversa and his sister's hand in marriage to get Rainulf on his side. Rainulf took the deal, but after his Lombard wife died a few years later, he sided once again with Pandulf to depose Sergius a second time. Here again, it's worth emphasizing that there were no Norman interests per se, no grand plan of carving out a Norman fiefdom. Instead, there was a sequence of opportunities that were energetically seized upon. It didn't matter if those opportunities came from Pandulf or Sergius, or from any Lombard or Byzantine representative. If the price was right, a Norman was there to collect. Though many among these Normans were low-born riffraff, a good deal of them were the second and third-born sons of nobility, trained to be some of the finest warriors in all of Christendom. Around the age of 7, a boy would leave his father's household to serve another lord as a page. He would perform menial tasks around the house until he was ready to engage in combat sports like wrestling or fighting with wooden weapons. Eventually, he would be mentored by a knight trained in the art of war. At 14 or so, the boy became a squire. Now he could seriously study the art and science of killing. He learned the cavalry charge, accompanied his mentor into battle, rode with him, dressed him, tended to his equipment, supplied him with horses, weapons, and any accoutrements that were needed on the field of battle. Only one thing was forbidden the squire, and that was the formal right to wear a knightly sword of his own. That was a privilege reserved for the belted man. Yet squires could still plunge into battle behind their master knight, sometimes emerging in triumph with a sword they had taken from the hands of a defeated opponent. Around the age of 21, with over a decade of experience in horsemanship, wrestling, and swordsmanship, the young man became a knight. But why did he come to Italy? Writing at the end of the 11th century, the Norman monk Geoffrey Malaterra described their motivations as follows. They saw their own neighborhood would not be big enough for them, that when their patrimony was divided, not only would their heirs argue among themselves about the share out, but the individual shares would simply not be big enough. Several things are worth unpacking there. At the time, the system of partible inheritance dominated not just Normandy, but in France as a whole. This is what Malaterra is referencing. According to this system, a lord's domain was equally divided between his children upon his death, with the eldest receiving the primary title. Since this wasn't anything unique to the Normans, it doesn't really explain that much. A more distinctive aspect of Normandy was the continual influx of migrants from the Scandinavian motherland, presumably from Norway and Denmark in particular. These migrants, along with the prodigious breeding habits of certain Norman lords, probably did contribute to a rising population. Tancred, the progenitor of the Hauteville line, is undoubtedly the best example. Fathering 12 sons in total, much of his brood must have been yanking at the bit to make their name and fortune. Yet the historian Levi Roche warns us not to place too much stock in the overpopulation argument, something he calls a medieval trope. Though the population of Normandy was increasing, that was also true of France and Western Europe in general. In fact, population growth was one of the most important trends of the High Middle Ages, which began in the year 1000 and perfectly coincides with the Normans' arrival in Italy. By this point in the story of Europe, the calamities of the late antique period had passed, farming techniques were being perfected, new lands cleared, cities, universities, and monasteries founded, and all across Europe, the population boomed. But did any other peoples flock in such great numbers to Sicily? For the most part, no. Again, leaving us with the question of why the Normans did so. Besides population growth, the most frequently cited explanation is pilgrimage. In some cases, we're told that the Normans went to Italy for the shrine at Monte Gargano. In others, that Italy was merely a stopover on the way to the Holy Land. Here again, Roche argues that pilgrimage is an insufficient explanation, and for the same reason. It was a wider European trend. To be sure, it may have been part of the reason the first Normans journeyed to Italy, but it doesn't explain why they kept coming. Instead, Roche tells us, we should look at the duchy's intricate political situation in the early and mid-11th century. It became fashionable around that time to exile rather than execute opponents. Rainulf's brother, Gilbert, was one such exile, and his departure resulted in more Drengos coming with him. This turned southern Italy into the medieval equivalent of Australia, a self-designated penal colony for high-profile Normans. The more age-appropriate comparison, however, would probably be to Iceland, then filled with many of Norway's biggest troublemakers. More generally speaking, the 1030s to the 1040s were a transitional period from the rule of Duke Robert to that of his son William, later to be known as the Conqueror. Back then, he was but a child, yet his position was sufficiently secure, due to the crown's peculiar interest in Normandy, for the region's second-borns, third-borns, and so on to look beyond the duchy for greener pastures elsewhere. As we discussed already, southern Italy offered these pastures by virtue of its fractious nature, while much of the rest of Europe grew more and more ossified, centralized, and populous. Here was a land ripe for the taking. Once upon a time, Rollo had come to West Francia to take advantage of a similar situation, a land divided between squabbling lordlings with an absence of centralized authority. After securing the county of Rouen, Rollo and his successors slowly extended their control over other Viking settlers until they established the Duchy of Normandy. How could we find it surprising then that this same region produced the next generation of Europe's great adventurers? Bastards, brigands, and exiles with Christian rituals, Nordic origins, and Frankish methods of war. By this point, they seem to have forgotten the Viking art of shipbuilding, with most of them traveling to Italy by land rather than by sea. Writing of the events of 1067, which we will cover later, the chronicler William of Apulia reports that the Norman people had known nothing of naval war up till then. Yet only the previous year, in 1066, William the Conqueror had ferried thousands of men, horses, and supplies over the English Channel. Some time ago, a scholar suggested that William got advice on ferrying his horses from the Italian Normans, who in turn learned to do so from the Byzantine Empire. Whether or not that is true, what seems beyond dispute is that the care once lavished on hewing longboats was now applied to raising war horses. R.H.C. Davis notes that the Normans refined Carolingian-era horse breeding techniques. They fed their horses with a grain-rich diet to promote growth and set aside large tracts of land for stud farms. Studs were also rotated between herds, and stallions and mares alike selected for size and strength. The result was a mounted elite, men and horses alike bred and trained for excellence. In Italy, a couple hundred of them weren't just capable of crushing an army 10 times their size, they were almost expected to. In 1040, 300 Norman knights accompanied the Byzantine expedition into Sicily. Their objective? To besiege the ancient city of Syracuse, then under Muslim control. Included in this knightly contingent was William, the eldest of the 3 Hauteville brothers who accompanied him. This was a chance for William to get a good look at Harold Hardrada, the last Viking who would have been present along with the rest of the Varangian Guard. One has to wonder what a conversation between these two distantly related adventurers would have looked like, but sadly, such an encounter must be left to our imaginations. To gain the advantage, the emir decided to sally out with some of the garrison in an ill-judged effort to destroy their siege equipment, but William and his brothers were mounted up and ready. Beaming down on the emir and his bodyguard at a canter and then a wild gallop, William tugged in his knees, lowered his lance, and braced himself for impact. Cleanly skewering the emir out of his saddle, William left him lying in the dirt to scan his surroundings for more enemies. Yet no one else dared approach the Normans now. Instead, the defenders retreated in a daze, the Byzantine army cheered in disbelief, and the emir's lifeless body was forgotten in the swirling dust. Not long after, the city surrendered. From this point onward, William became known as Bras de Fer, meaning Iron Arm. And in the years that followed, never once did he fail to live up to his sobriquet. When a challenge presented itself, he and the other Normans acted without hesitation. Only the following year, they became the muscle behind another Lombard revolt. But this time, they received the region around Melfi as their prize. Reynos' acquisition of Aversa had put them on the map, and now this was another sign that the Normans weren't going anywhere. Even so, the empire wasn't going to give up quite that easily. Reinforced by thousands of Varangians under the command of Harold Hardrada, the Romans, as they proudly would have called themselves, began to mass an army in Italy. Against them, the Normans mustered a mighty but measly force of 300 knights and 600 infantry, enough for a final stand but little else near the Olivento River. The night before the battle, the Empire issued the customary message: stand down, go home, disperse, and be spared. The emissary unlucky enough to be assigned this message was duly received by William Ironarm as well as his inner circle. Among this circle was the inimitable Hugh Tuduboof, who was standing ominously close to the mounted messenger. As the messenger nervously got on with his task, Hugh stroked the steed's mane in a characteristically impertinent manner. Scarcely had the emissary concluded before Hugh unleashed a mailed fist straight at the horse's head, knocking it out in one clean blow. On his way down, the messenger was knocked out also. Only after the Normans had finished laughing did they bother to find a new steed to prop the dazed messenger upon. With a slap to this replacement horse's behind, they sent him flying back to his camp, where details of the parley were understandably kept a secret. The following morning, the Empire positioned its army at a bend in the river, this to minimize the maneuverability of the Normans' heavy cavalry. But despite being packed like sardines, the outnumbered Norman knights managed to break past the Imperial line and send chaos through their ranks. Many Imperial soldiers were cut down as they ran, others were drowned and trampled, and Harold Hardrada scarcely escaped with his life. Had he died here at Olivento, who knows if the Norman invasion of England would have succeeded a quarter century later. All the same, the Empire scrambled to raise another army and brought in fresh Varangian reinforcements, led once again by the dauntless Harold Hardrada. A few months later, they met a Lombard-Norman force at Monte Maggiore. This time, the situation was different. William Ironarm was ill, barely well enough to attend the battle from a stretcher positioned on a nearby slope. In a repeat of the last battle, the Empire again outnumbered the rebels and positioned its troops along a bend in the river. This time, however, the Norman cavalry failed to pierce the Imperial line and slowly got bogged down. Somehow, though, William forced his body to obey his mind, jumping out of his stretcher, mounting his horse, and helping to turn the tide of the battle. Yet again, many of the Empire's soldiers died in the rout or in the river, and yet again, Harold Hardrada miraculously managed to escape. At this point, we have to ask ourselves, how did the Normans achieve this kind of outcome time and time again? Much of it, as we'll see, had to do with their signature heavy cavalry attack. The Byzantine princess Anna Komnene, author of the Alexiad, summarized things pretty well, even while conflating the Normans with the Franks. "For a Frank on horseback is invincible," she wrote, "and would even make a hole in the walls of Babylon. But directly he gets off his horse, anyone who likes can make sport of him." Though the Normans weren't as heavily armored as later knights would be, say at the Battle of Agincourt, they still had enough on to be significantly slower on foot. Keep him on his horse, though, and the Norman knight remained the apex predator. In fact, the medieval period as a whole was dominated by the mounted knight, often referred to as the battle tank of that era. In the case of the Normans, theirs was an early prototype, but judging from the results, a wildly effective one. To achieve their level of discipline on horseback, the Normans likely practiced charges and feints on a regular basis. They would have known how to fight knee to knee in a line or wedge formation, and not unlike seasoned bicycle riders, would have been able to steer their horses with their knees. The Normans also had spurs and reins to control the horse's speed and coordinate with those beside them. They also coordinated with the commander in the middle of the pack, who directed the charge and led from the front. The charge would begin at a canter and pick up a terrifying momentum as the distance was closed. Under each man's armpit, a 10-foot-long lance was couched so that the group descended on the enemy like a humongous iron-quilled porcupine. The Norman saddles had high backs for support on impact, and it was this innovation, alongside the stirrup, that enabled a knight to couch his lance to deliver the signature blow. The only way to stop the Norman onslaught was to bring longer spears, or otherwise to have troops so experienced, disciplined, and fearless that they could face down hundreds of horses furiously riding toward them without breaking rank and running for their lives. Failing that, the Normans would impale, bludgeon, or trample virtually anyone who stood in their path. If the enemy panicked and broke, the Normans would ride them down with ease, and it was during the rout that most of their enemies were killed, as was the case in the vast majority of medieval engagements. Once in a while, the Normans' enemies did hold firm, as they did at Monte Maggiore. Then it came down to hard fighting or a feigned retreat. With a cavalry force as capable as theirs, the Normans were closely wedded to the latter tactic. After feigning retreat and quickly regrouping, the Normans could charge at a pursuing enemy and punish them for leaving formation. In fact, in the English theater, the Normans are believed to have feigned retreat several times during the Battle of Hastings. All these factors explain how the Norman knight became the gold standard not just in Italy, but also in France and England. If you didn't see Norman knights raiding the countryside, you would likely have seen them training, riding in the plains, drilling, practicing how to charge and ride in formation. Combine superb discipline with unflappable morale, and you start to piece together how they won so many battles. To reiterate, most casualties in medieval engagements happened after the enemy turned tail and ran. It was a matter of esprit de corps, something the Normans had in spades. Rather than cowering in the face of danger, they laughed in it, just as they had before Olivento. They didn't simply accept, they embraced the nasty, brutish, and short reality of life in the Middle Ages. They took mass, gave confession, and simply got on with the job. A decade after the Melfi land grant, Norman power was rapidly growing. Some land was granted, some was seized, but in almost direct proportion to the size of their domain, the number of mercenary contracts correspondingly dwindled. This led some Normans to resort to the tried and true method of raiding, though this time not even their own lands were spared. Amatus of Montecassino, another of our primary sources, wrote that they rode gaily off through the meadows and gardens and returned with immense plunder. What they liked, they took, and what they did not like, they left. These years of Norman ascendancy were dampened not just by raiding, but also by famines and revolts, both downstream of the raids. While the Normans were unsurpassed in the ways of war, they still had much to learn about stewardship, at least here in Italy. All the while, Pope Leo IX looked on with resentment. As Wilbert, his monastic biographer, wrote, the Normans had been welcomed as liberators, but soon they became oppressors. John, the abbot of Fécamp, wrote to Leo that across Italy, hatred of the Norman has now become so great that it is near impossible for a Norman, even if he is a pilgrim, to travel through the cities of Italy without being set upon, abducted, stripped of all he has, beaten, and tied with chains. Thus, in 1052, Leo planned a rather unorthodox move. He secured an alliance with the Byzantine Empire. Despite their religious differences, the two powers combined their forces the following year to achieve what neither could do on their own: wipe the Normans off the face of the peninsula. During that winter, Leo also requested aid from the Holy Roman Emperor, who was able to spare 700 Swabians. These were giant men, famous for their massive two-handed swords. By springtime, Leo was heading south, accompanied by the Swabians, and raising troops all down the peninsula. Soon he would link up with the newly landed Byzantine army. Meanwhile, the Normans were led by Humphrey, the youngest of the first set of Tancred's sons. By that point, his older brothers William Ironarm and Drogo were dead, but as we'll soon see, his younger half-brothers were poised to make their mark. Humphrey cautiously trailed Leo during his southward march. His goal was to intercept the papal force before it joined with the Byzantine army. Virtually every Norman in Italy, even those in the garrisons, was called to arms for the battle to follow. The confrontation would take place outside the city of Civitate. On their way there, the Normans experienced the consequences of being as unpopular as they were. Most of the cities they passed closed their gates to them, forcing the Normans to live off the land. They also had no intelligence on the incoming Byzantine army, neither about their distance, nor their size, nor their composition. In a rare moment of hesitation, the Normans sent messengers to negotiate with the Pope in Civitate. They even expressed their willingness to nominally answer to him as the Principality of Benevento was doing. Usually it was the Normans who towered over their enemies, but on this occasion, they were dwarfed by the giant Swabians, who took the opportunity to mock the Normans for being short and scrawny. The Pope, meanwhile, had no interest in making a deal. He stalled negotiations for as long as he could in hopes of the Byzantine army's impending arrival. Dejected and empty-handed, the Norman messengers finally returned to their camp in the evening. It was decided then that they would attack in the morning. Rising early, the Normans suited up, assembled into formation, and sent their last string of messengers, who of course received no reply. The papal coalition that lined up in front of them was roughly 6,000 strong, with the giant Swabians standing in a shallow line on the right flank with their two-handed swords. Despite still being outnumbered, the Normans had a larger force than they had ever assembled in Italy: 3,000 knights and 500 infantry, divided into three main groups. Across from the Swabians was the one and only Robert Guiscard, who you will remember from the start of this video. Robert commanded the Norman left, Rainulf's nephew Richard of Aversa the Norman right, and Humphrey commanded the center. Amatus tells us that Richard was young, fresh-faced, and of radiant beauty, so that all who saw him loved him, and also that his curious habit was to ride a horse so small that his feet nearly touched the ground. Richard charged right away against the left side of the papal coalition, made up of the hodgepodge of recruits assembled along the way. That side of the army broke almost immediately, and Richard pursued them off the battlefield for many miles. Humphrey, meanwhile, advanced up the center toward the Swabian line and engaged them on a small hill that had separated the two armies. There, the fighting was hardest. The Swabians were not afraid of the Normans and were ready to test their outsized mettle. Seeing his half-brother getting bogged down, Robert rode in to help him, and the fighting descended into savagery. The chronicler William of Apulia tells us that Robert was dashed 3 times from his horse, and 3 times he leaped back into the saddle. Having chased the left flank as far as he could, Richard returned to the battlefield and quickly surrounded the Swabians. As the Pope watched on in horror from the walls of Civitate, the Swabians refused to surrender and were cut down to size. Shortly after, the officials of the city decided to escort the Pope and his entourage outside the gates and lock the doors behind them. Their piety still intact, the Normans showed the Pope mercy. They bowed to the successor of St. Peter and dutifully assumed responsibility for his safety. The battlefield was cleaned up, the wounded tended to, and special accommodations made for the Holy Father. Malaterra writes that the Pope was grateful for their respect and kindness towards him, gave them pardon and blessing for their offenses, and granted them all the land which they had seized and of which they could possess themselves in future in Calabria and Sicily, to be held as an hereditary fief from St. Peter by themselves and their heirs. It was an about-face as could only be achieved through a trial of arms, but behind closed doors, Leo wrote letters to every corner of Christendom to try to expunge the Normans a second time. Since no one obliged him, however, he and his successors slowly got used to the new status quo. Though the new arrangement came at the direct expense of the Holy Roman Empire, formerly the papacy's protector, for the moment the successors of Charlemagne were too busy on the other side of the Alps. As for the Normans, they were now experiencing a transition of power. With the death of Humphrey in 1057, the baton of leadership passed to Robert Guiscard. As the eldest of Tancred's second set of sons, he had come to Italy about a decade prior, around the time of William's death. Significantly younger than his half-brothers, Robert was forced to cut his teeth in Calabria all on his lonesome. For one, he had not grown up with his half-brothers, nor did they have much to offer at the time of his arrival. But with the death of Humphrey, the path was clear for Robert to solidify his control of the region and to become the first Hauteville Duke. The moment came about a quarter century after William Ironarm's arrival. It had been a gradual process, but much swifter compared to the formation of Normandy. When Robert was formally invested with the dukedom by Pope Nicholas II, he was actually given the title Duke of Apulia, Calabria, and Sicily. This despite the fact that the island of Sicily was still in Muslim control. Yet the message was clear. Sooner or later, Sicily would fall to the Pope's new favorites. According to the great historian John Julius Norwich, Robert possessed to an extraordinary degree those two qualities of temperament which are indispensable to political greatness: the superb self-confidence that melts away doubts and difficulties and allows ambition to keep pace with imagination, and the inexhaustible energy that never failed until in his 70th year, death overtook him. It is a further credit to Robert that despite her bias against the Normans, the Byzantine princess Anna Komnene had this to say of him: he did not allow any obstacle to prevent his executing his desire. His stature was so lofty that he surpassed even the tallest. His complexion was ruddy, his hair flaxen, his shoulders were broad, his eyes all but emitted sparks of fire, and in frame he was well built. Anna also had much to say about Robert's son Bohemond, whose story we'll save for another time. For now, it suffices to say that the annulment of the union that produced Bohemond left him with a disputed inheritance. The annulment was occasioned by the necessity of Robert's second marriage, this one to the Lombard princess Siciliae. The marriage would finally unite the Lombards and Normans under a single banner. Around this time, the youngest of the 12 Hauteville brothers arrived on the scene. His name was Roger, and before he became his brother's lieutenant, he also had to cut his teeth in the usual Norman fashion. Malaterra wrote that he was a most handsome young man, tall and well-made, a most fluent speaker, shrewd in counsel, far-sighted in the planning of things to be done, cheerful and pleasant to everyone, strong and valiant, fierce in battle. Through these qualities, in a short time he achieved general admiration. Together, the two brothers would divide and conquer. Robert would focus on clearing Italy of Byzantine control, and Roger on conquering Sicily. Any territory that the latter conquered would be split evenly between them. In 1059, Roger seized the city of Reggio just across the strait from Messina, this becoming the launching pad of his attacks into Sicily. Malaterra reports that Roger attacked a very brave man of enormous size, who was reviling the Norman army with many insults, and of whom everybody was terrified as though by a giant, overthrew him with a strong lance, and killed him. His death in this manner so frightened the others in the castrum that when they saw the machines being prepared for the capture of the city, they doubted their own forces and felt themselves to be lost. Though Roger sometimes benefited from Robert's support, more often than not, elder brother called on younger one. While Robert focused on besieging Byzantine holdouts in Bari, Roger made lightning raids into Sicily with a skeleton crew of fewer than 1,000 men. Over time, the loyal, tireless, and capable Roger became his older brother's right-hand man. But soon, Roger found a lieutenant for himself in the form of his nephew Serlo II, a fresh arrival from Normandy. At the time of Serlo's arrival, Sicily was embroiled in a three-way civil conflict between the Muslim powers on the island. And just as the fractured situation of mainland Italy allowed the Normans to arrive and assume control, the same thing now took place in Sicily. On one of his first raids, Roger made landfall north of the city of Messina with just 400 men, including 150 knights and his nephew Sirlo. Avoiding Messina itself, they quickly took some towns and loaded up on plunder, yet the garrison of the city was alerted, and it didn't take long for the defenders to hatch a plan to ambush the Normans upon their return, when they would be coming back to their ships laden with booty. After the Normans did return, choppy waters prevented them from loading their ships quickly, and the Muslims delayed their ambush. Eventually, Roger learned of the massive garrison force encamped in the hills above him, and in response he sent out his nephew Sirlo to flank around the garrison, to ambush the ambushers. After the operation proved successful, Roger thought he could follow it up by taking Messina itself, but after reaching the city, he and his detachment were nearly overwhelmed by the garrison force that sallied out. In a fleeting instance of Norman retreat, Roger and his men rushed back to their boats and barely escaped with their lives. Back on the beach, both sides eyed one another expectantly as the weather took a turn for the worse. Beneath the torrential rain, the Normans waited for an opportunity to load their ships and take off, while the Muslims waited for the perfect opportunity to strike. After 3 days of this game of soaking cat and mouse, the Normans were able to slip away after all. But no sooner had they done so than a flotilla of ships from Messina was headed straight at them. Roger and his men decided to barrel right through the flotilla, losing only one of their own vessels and pulling into harbor at nearby Reggio. Hungry, tired, soaked to the bone, but richer for it. All the while, another storm was brewing. A feud between Roger and Robert, which finally reached a head in 1062. As the elder of the two made inroads in mainland Italy, the younger balked at not receiving his fair share of land and loot. After getting married, Roger had certain obligations to his wife's family as per the Norman tradition of Morgengab, or morning gift. This obligation required the groom to enfief his in-laws, that is, to give them land. But for the moment, Roger simply lacked the means to do so. Fed up, he wrote to Robert to set things right, demanding he do so within 40 days or else he'd do it himself, that is, with his sword. Infuriated with his younger brother's belligerence, Robert gathered his men, rode into Calabria, and besieged the city of Mileto, where Roger was staying. Disguising himself, Roger snuck out in the middle of the night and made for the neighboring town of Geoffrey. Yet it would not be long before Robert found out and was nipping at his brother's heels. Since Geoffrey was loyal to Roger, Robert found the gates close to him, but now disguising himself, he entered the city and made his way to the house of Basil, a man on the inside that he trusted. Inside Basil's house, one of his servants recognized Robert and raised the alarm. Not long after, an angry mob was at the house's door. Basil and his wife tried to escape and were set upon and lynched by the townsfolk. Uncloaked, Robert had no choice but to confront the crowd for himself. Yet he did so with all his usual cleverness. It would be shameful, he said, to kill an unarmed Norman, the operative word here being Norman. Between themselves, as people may have had their differences, but if the crowd so much as laid a finger on Robert, those differences would be set aside and the city would have hell to pay. On the off chance he was telling the truth, the crowd decided to detain Robert rather than kill him, and after doing so, they sent for his brother Roger. In the meantime, Roger had ventured beyond Geoffrey, but upon returning to the city, he immediately accosted its magnates outside the city gates. Where was his brother, and why wasn't he here already? Was he harmed or killed? What was taking so long? As the people looked on with bated breath, Robert was finally led outside the city to his brother. Standing defenseless before him, all minds turned to a single question. What would Roger do with his older brother now? Closing the distance between them, Roger simply embraced him, and after a few manly tears, the two of them decided to bury the hatchet. Humbled by the whole experience, Robert vowed to make things right. He would oblige his brother's request for more land and loot, as he knew was well-deserved. As the two rode off, the townsfolk must have stood there bewildered. They had been expecting Cain and Abel, and got Benjamin and Joseph instead. From then on, the brothers would be as one. It took Robert almost 10 years, including a 3-year siege of Bari, to drive the Byzantine Empire out of Italy. Having secured the peninsula for himself by 1071, Robert would now receive all manner of honorifics from across the Adriatic. It was one of countless examples of the empire artfully saving face, of converting foes into friends and defeats into victories. Now the court of Constantinople showered Robert with gifts, titles, and even a marriage alliance. Robert's daughter Olympias was betrothed to the junior emperor Constantine Ducas. But when the betrothal was broken and Constantine ousted from power, Robert seized on the opportunity as a pretext for invasion. Now the Normans would take the fight to Constantinople, their most audacious gambit yet. Accompanying Robert was his 27-year-old son Bohemond, the one from his first marriage. Meanwhile, on the Byzantine side loomed the soldier emperor Alexios Komnenos, his love of the military arts tempered by cunning. Inciting rebellions in Italy, Alexios divided the Normans' energies and prevented a total takeover. Though he was repeatedly defeated in battle, slowly but surely Alexios managed to win the war. Bohemond, meanwhile, got invaluable experience in the eastern forms of warfare, which would serve him well on crusade. Back in Sicily, Roger spent 30 years trying to tame the island, only receiving reinforcements for the capture of Messina and Palermo. During his efforts to claim the Grand County of Sicily, Roger's nephew and Lieutenant Serlo met a tragic end in 1072. Instructed to raid the middle of the island while Roger focused on Palermo, a massive Muslim defense force ambushed his raiding party. In the process, Serlo may have been betrayed by a Muslim friend of his, but in any case, he and his men found themselves pinned against a large rock. Climbing to the top of the boulder, Serlo made a valiant last stand along with his fellow Normans. The monument at Serlo's Rock survived almost a millennium until a developer acquired the land in the 1960s and tore the monument down. In the same year that Serlo met his end, the Normans triumphantly entered Palermo. This would become the jewel in their crown, a glittering medieval metropolis that ranked alongside Paris and London. Compared to the aforementioned siege of Bari, taking Palermo was a quicker affair. Not only were Roger and Robert working together, by now the Normans had built a formidable naval presence. In January 1072, Roger assaulted the walls by land while Robert landed a smaller force on the seaward side and opened the city gates. It was a fine example of Norman coordination, as it would be one of Norman clemency. Only the following day, the Muslims in the inner citadel surrendered on generous terms. They would be allowed to live and to continue practicing their faith. At the same time, the mosque was converted back into a cathedral and the leading men replaced with Christians. As Levi Roche put it, like Duke William's conquest of England, this was an opportunistic land grab under papal license. And if William of Apulia, and in particular Geoffrey of Malaterra, were later to play up the religious element in these conflicts, it's because they were writing after the First Crusade had been launched. Holy War was now all the rage, so it was natural to recast Robert and Roger's conquests in such terms. After much bloodshed, Roger had concluded his conquest of Sicily by the late 11th century. In 1087, at the mountain fortress of Castro Giovanni, the emir could sense which way the wind was blowing, but he needed a way to save face. Only a week later, he rode out with his bodyguard and a small portion of his garrison and passed through a narrow defile. Soon the Muslims found themselves surrounded by a significantly larger force of Normans. The emir decided then and there to surrender, convert to Christianity, and peaceably retire to a small Italian estate. Thus, Roger took control of the last Sicilian stronghold and within 4 years also claimed every remaining city on the island. Outliving his older brother, Roger navigated the succession period by aligning himself with Roger Borsa, the weakest of Robert's heirs. In exchange, he received various territorial concessions on the mainland. This ensured his heirs would not only be masters of Sicily, but also well positioned to make a bid for southern Italy. While Roger II succeeded his father as Count of Sicily, Roger Borsa's successor, William II, died heirless. This would allow Roger II to claim all of southern Italy for himself. A disputed papal succession in 1130 also enabled Roger to intervene on behalf of an anti-pope, supporting him in exchange for royal recognition. Eventually, it would be a different papal contender, Innocent II, who wound up on the throne of St. Peter with the backing of the Holy Roman Empire. Then followed 9 years of rebellions, excommunications, and skirmishes between Innocent and Roger. After excommunicating him in April of 1139, Innocent led a massive army into southern Italy to put an end to the Norman threat, much like his predecessor Leo IX attempted to do almost a century earlier. On the hills of Galluccio, the Pope's army nearly ran headlong into a Norman force positioned on the opposite hill. The Pope's army hastily started to change directions and completely failed to notice the additional force of 1,000 or so Normans charging straight at them. These were led by Roger II's son, Roger III, who bulldozed past Innocent's men and scattered them in all directions. Riding into the middle of their camp, Roger even managed to capture the Pope himself. After a few days spent as an esteemed houseguest, much in the manner of Leo IX, Pope Innocent signed the Treaty of Mignano, fully recognizing Roger II as King of Sicily and Naples. With bounteous reserves of energy, audacity, and opportunism, coupled with a healthy dose of luck, a handful of Frankified Vikings had carved out a kingdom in a distant land. They did it on a shoestring budget, outnumbered and outspent by the greatest powers of that time. On 2 occasions, they captured a pope and got a duchy, then a kingdom out of the bargain. When the age of the armed pilgrimage or crusade began, these new papal favorites would be among the most prolific and effective crusaders to come pouring out of Christendom. In the next video, we will look at their feats of arms in still more theaters of conflicts, the lands of Asia and Africa, where they would be tested like never before. Thanks for watching. To learn even more about the Normans, go check out this episode's co-writer, Michael of Memory Medieval. He runs one of my favorite channels on YouTube with deep dives on all sorts of topics in medieval history. Also be on the lookout for his upcoming Norman-themed deck of playing cards, which we'll have more details on very soon. Thanks again, and see you in the next episode.